I start with evolution again, but this time pre-human, pre-hominid, pre-primate. For some 40 million years, our mammal and then primate ancestors experienced this dynamic. It's more than an image. This resonates in our mind, scattering of light, the combination of shades of green. This is why I call this my sanctuary, which is, now that I'm almost entirely homebound, I take my naps, I take my rest, I do my meditations in this environment, and I'm thankful for it. I spend much of my day and all of my nights out here. In the heat of summer, I put on this fan. In winter, I use my parka and blankets. So off I went to Pennsylvania in January of 2002 after a former professor of mine from the Sustainable and Organic Agriculture programs at the University of California, Davis, Bill Liebhardt, had asked me to come out to the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania to do a postdoctoral year doing research on Rodale's ongoing experiments on organic farming. At that time, I had a reliable 1980s four-door K car with bench seats and a huge trunk. I took out its back bench seat, and then having put all of my stuff in clear plastic bags in a half dozen sizes, loaded everything, and we caravanned out Interstate 80 with a good weather window being January for 4 days and got to Pennsylvania. The Rodale Institute was the first organization in the U.S. to research and promote organic farming and gardening, started by the grandfather, J.I. Rodale. After I got there, the distinction between my California culture and its difference from the local culture became quite apparent. And the thing is that our genes are probably about as similar as any in the world, because my ancestors from both sides had done generational sojourns as they were doing their what is known as westering. That'll be in my ancestors chapter. The people there in Berks County were known as Dutchies, in other words, Deutsch or German. My name is Lauder, it's German. And I commiserate with my professor's widow, who is Californian and lived out there when he was at Rodale. And we tell anecdotes about the Pennsylvania Dutchies and their, to me, odd conservativeness and inflexibility. So an example that was the 20 water heaters in the basement of this apartment with piping to 20 different apartments, despite the fact that anyone with some mental flexibility would see that a single tank with no metering and just, built into the cost built into the rent would easily be more cost effective. But no, we got to know who's using a lot of hot water and who's conserving. Controlled, about control. So that's just one example of things I came up against over and over in a way that was much more obvious than in California. Of course, California is not without its control freaks, but I did adjust and made friends. I initially moved to the city of Reading nearby, and the Reading had been sort of hollowed out. Back apparently in the 60s and 70s, New York City was taking troublemakers and putting them on buses to Reading, Pennsylvania, which is only a couple hours by bus. That was the story, anyway, that I heard. And so Reading was, at that time, a crime capital and even some kind of murder capital of the United States, which I did not know. So I moved into this basement apartment in Reading, and it was huge. It was probably 30 feet by 30 feet, which is all I needed. It was right downtown. I moved in there, but then in doing my research or just talking to people, I found out about the Reading Prong. The Reading Prong is a geological formation that includes the city of Reading, in which the rock underneath is very high in uranium, and it gives off a gas known as radon gas. And the worst place you can be is in a basement apartment with cracks in the cement floors, which it had, and with cold weather. Of course, I moved in January. You had to keep it closed. So I found this out, I researched it, and I moved out within 3 days. I found another place. I sacrificed last month's rent and the security deposit. And I moved to a place known as Trexler. Now, rural Pennsylvania is just crisscrossed with literally thousands of little villages, crossroads, that they called a town back in the old days, and it would have usually a hotel with a restaurant and a bar, and sometimes it grew into a town or a city, and other times it just remained a crossroads. Well, this town of Trexler, not Trexler Town was another place nearby. Now, this was the town of Trexler, or the place on the map known as Trexler. And so, upstairs apartment above the old general store that was at that crossroads. And when it warmed up a little bit and the snow had gone away, I could ride my bike to Rodale, and it was very hilly, but I loved the work of riding the bike. One of the stories I like to tell about my California culture is about my friend Javier Rodriguez, who played soccer with him back in the early 70s. Okay, it's 50 years ago now. And he played soccer for UC Davis, got his degree, and worked for the state government in Sacramento. But Javier married a Pennsylvanian, but from Pittsburgh, from around Pittsburgh. In the urban areas, what did James Carville say about Pennsylvania? There's Pittsburgh in the west, Philadelphia in the east, and Alabama in between. And so every Christmas, back until 2020, I would go down and camp in Mexico. And Javier, having married a Pennsylvanian, went and spent Christmas there in Pennsylvania. So I was spending my vacation where his ancestors were, down in Mexico, and enjoying the Mexicans. And I really enjoy the Mexicans, and I've talked about that in Will. And Javier was in Pennsylvania, where my ancestors are. And so that's the story I like to tell. That's my culture. Okay, that's my California culture. Oh, and by the way, Javier is a Republican. And so it just goes against that myth that some people perpetrate about, oh, those Latinos, those Mexicans are taking over California and they want to make California Chicano state or Aztlan or whatever. People of California take on the California culture. Some Republican, mostly Democrat, and a few fringe types, no matter the ethnicity. Oh, and while I'm on the subject, here's data to show that Latino women are having fewer than the replacement rate of children, fewer than 2.1 children per woman in her lifetime. So another bit of myth busting. This area of Pennsylvania, Berks County, was early on settled by Mennonites. And the Mennonites, in this case, there's all sorts of different of what they call the plain sects. Or Anabaptist is another word for them. They're the Amish, who were in another area down near Gettysburg and Lancaster. But the Mennonites were in this area. They drove horse-drawn buggies, and they were all farmers. They used tractors, but without rubber tires. So the wheels were metal. And I remember seeing this tractor just flying across a field. The tractor was turning over the windrowed hay that was in long rows in this field. And it was this young Mennonite woman in her traditional cotton long dress and blonde hair and just flying across this thing. And metal wheels would have been bumpy. Rodale, I think, originally went there and learned quite a bit from the Mennonites because they were originally organic farmers. They farmed naturally. My favorite Mennonite was a woman named Lizzie, who on her farm, she had a couple of barns that were full of stuff that she sold. And this was back when I had to go to Allentown or Bethlehem to get stuff, but I would stop by Lizzie's, which was on the way, and I would have a list of stuff, whether it was tape and tools and certain clothings or whatever. And Lizzie would point me in the direction, and this barn was just full of buckets and barrels and tables full of stuff. She was quite a character. I always enjoyed buying stuff like that. And then the other thing that they did in Pennsylvania that was different from California was that they would have auctions when they had estate sales, and they would hire an auctioneer. And Pennsylvania had a very large population and dense rural population and much less income disparity than, say, in the South or other places. And so there were these crossroads, thousands of them. And then around each one of those, there were hundreds of small farms and houses. And the grandchildren would inherit, and they'd be living in some other state, and they would have to liquidate everything so they could sell the place. And so these houses that had been lived in for 200 years would open up, and they'd be selling all this vintage furniture and carpets and things like that. Anyway, I had fun collecting stuff. One of my indelible memories of Pennsylvania, the enormous hulk of the old steel mills. As I drove past Bethlehem and Allentown, they left this hulking, huge, rusting steel mill with its stacks and very tall factories and pipes and stuff. And it just was, for me, a sign that represented the downfall of the old U.S. steel and raw material manufacturing sector. When the going gets stressful, I have always, until about 5 years ago, grabbed my backpack. I have stuff, I've done this so many scores of times that I have a little list. I can throw things together, and I can get away to do an overnight somewhere, usually on a ridge top. In Pennsylvania, working in the first month, Rodale, just needed to get away. It was February, and it was cold, and there was snow everywhere, and where can I go? And I looked around, I asked people that, and I heard about the Delaware Water Gap Park and the Delaware River, and I threw my stuff together and put it in the K car, and it was cold, so I put everything together that I would need for cold, a tent and my trusty little Svea stove and plenty of food. And I drove the hour or so to get to this park, and I hiked up into the hills, and I was the only one. There was no one there. I think if I had told anybody, well, I told Bill Liebhardt, I always tell someone, if I'm not back, here's where I'm going to be. I went up into this park, and Bill knew me, and he was a real kind of an outdoor guy. He said, okay, he probably thought I was going for a day hike or something and was going to car camp. I hiked up into these hills. There was no one on the trails. I was the only one there. And as I went up in elevation, 1,000 or 2 feet, it just got colder. But for me to hike was a way to regenerate. It's been a real spiritual and physical and mental healing. And so up I went and set up my tent next to a lake in a place that during warmer weather there would have been plenty of other campers. I think if I told people, they would have said, oh my God, no, it's freezing up there. Don't. So I set up my tent, got in, and fired up the stove, which I can do inside my tent. Done it so many times. Real careful. It's a white gas stove, and cooked up a nice hot soup and in all my clothes and jacket, got into my sleeping bag and slept. And it was down below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I woke up in the morning, and the water bottle next to me was frozen solid. But I got up, I fired up the stove and made up a nice hot oatmeal breakfast, and packed up my stuff and hiked out, and it was better. But I got to laugh because that kind of cold just didn't faze me. I needed that getaway. And being from California, I was used to doing it anytime. Back then, we didn't have the great weather prediction that we do now, where you can look at the hourly and you can look at what it's going to do. So that was memorable. Later in the spring, when things warmed up and the snow melted, I learned that the Appalachian Trail was less than an hour drive away. It was quite close to where I lived in Trexler, and I would go there, and I'd get up to the ridge tops. I did discover that there were a type of rattlesnake that and doesn't bother you, but they're huge. But I enjoyed going into what they call mountains, what we would call hills in California. As a postdoctoral scientist, I worked at Rodale on their ongoing research programs. They had a farming systems trial, which is still going on and quite well known, a comparison between conventional crop production and two types of organic production, one with manure and the other with cover crops, with the legume crops as nitrogen sources, those two. And I gave talks to different organizations about the research I had done and the writing that I was doing. So I'll go through my PowerPoints very fast here because only about 10% of you will be interested in the data and the things I show, and you can always press pause and look at the slide. But the basic picture of organic farming and its benefits compared to conventional crop production with fertilizers and pesticides. Rodale at that time was also starting their research on organic zero tillage, and I see now that the farm manager with whom I worked, Jeff Moyer, has written a book and published it, which has everything you need about it. But it was quite challenging because what they needed to do with these cover crops that they would plant in the fall, and so it would usually be rye and vetch being the legume nitrogen fixer, and rye was a grass that would capture a lot of nitrogen upon decomposition in the soil. And so the thing you had to do, though, was to get those two crops and any others killed so that you could plant corn or soybeans or whatever crop into that zero-till cover crop. And so it was quite challenging because sometimes the weather would not cooperate and it might rain for a few days and get it too wet when you needed to get in to plant the seed, and then it wasn't enough time to roll down and kill the cover crop. What they developed there was a roller crimper that they would fill with water, so it would be very heavy, and that would roll along in front of the tractor. And in the back of the tractor they had seeders that were developed for seeding into heavy cover. It would cut through the cover. One of the examples of zero tillage was the Cedar Meadow farm that Steve Grof developed. A lot of his land he made zero tillage. They had this one year where a hurricane, I think it was 1998, a hurricane came up from the Caribbean up the east coast of the United States and then stopped and rained for, I think, 3, 4, 5 straight days, 24/7 on Pennsylvania, and caused a huge amount of flooding and the loss of huge amounts of soil, because this happened during the summer when the soils were exposed. And so Steve Grof got out there and he actually took a video camera. This is 1998 when the video cameras were kind of big and clunky, but he took it out and he took videos and photos of the clear rainwater running off of his farm, and then the completely muddy, murky soil, sedimented water running off of neighboring farms. Pennsylvania is quite hilly, and so tons of soil were lost to the creeks and the rivers after that hurricane storm. Many people, especially from outside Berks County, the area where the Rodale Institute is, are quite, critical or laugh about the Dutchie culture that makes up that area. And I experienced it. One of the more, I guess, impactful experiences I had was when they hired a guy to be in charge of international programs. And this guy worked in Africa for an entire career, for like 20 years, and he knew all the ropes of international programs. And Rodale wanted to branch out, especially to Central America and the Caribbean. And I would have been part of that because I had experience with international agriculture and a degree in it. So I used to love to do dinner parties. I really enjoyed putting together 5, 6, 7, or 8 people. I could sit around a table None of this American habit of sitting around on couches and chairs and eating out of paper plates on your lap or whatever. I hate that. I would invite people over. I'd set up a table with all the chairs. I think there were 7 people at this one. This was in the little apartment up of the general store in Trexler. And I would get the lighting right. I hate bright lights. I would turn them down. I'd put lamps, good shades in the background, and then put candles on the table. And then I would make up a huge lasagna. I made it from scratch, and I was really good at that. Kind of missed my calling of being a chef. And you can put the lasagna on a side table right nearby, so that when people want more, you don't even have to get up. They just reach over and you take a big slice. It's covered up and it's still nice and hot. And people would bring wine, and we would sit for hours. I loved doing that. And so I had a dinner party, and I invited this new international guy who I really liked. And one of them was a worker who had been there, who was a very social guy and a very interesting guy. He had a lot of stories to tell about Rodale. Been with Rodale probably 20, 25 years. And so this new international guy who had been there a month, it just took off and lambasted the administrators at Rodale. He just took off after them. He and this worker were the only ones from Rodale. And he spent a good 30 minutes just blistering and lambasting these people's Dutchy inflexible ways of doing things, which I was getting used to. As little as a week later, I can't remember how long, he was gone. He had been given his walking papers, and the international program really never took off after that. I had gone to Costa Rica, and I had a pretty good plan. I was, at that time, 2002, the Central American, South American farmers, Mexican farmers, small farmers, didn't have computers. They didn't have access to the internet. They were far away. They didn't know. And you could at that time go into various, what they call internet cafes, but they didn't know how to do that. And what I wanted to do was a weekly program, and I was contacting this organization, Farm Radio, about doing it with them, but doing a 1-hour radio program each week in which I would go over the things that I found on the web, on the internet. Look at what the Colombian coffee farmers are doing. Look at what composting in Cuba. Here's where you can look up stuff about, for example, integrated pest management for banana. And then I would talk about this on the radio and then give the keywords you want to put in to go to this website to find out about integrated pest management of banana. That would have been the Rodale Hour. And of course, every farmer had a radio, and the signals of the main radio stations reached every part of every country in Latin America. Each country had at least 2 or 3 radio stations whose signal was strong enough to reach even little valleys in the hills and mountains. And of course, it would all have been in Spanish. But the international program fell apart, and they hired me to be a journalist. The Rodale New Farm magazine hired me to travel and write articles for them. And so I designed a plan to drive from Pennsylvania up through the Catskills, visiting organic farms, up to Canada, to one of the easternmost provinces, Quebec, and then drive west. So I visited a small organic operation in the Catskills, and then went up to Montreal. And it was summertime, and students at the university had gone home, and so the dormitories had cut-rate rooms that you could rent. I stayed at Montreal, went and visited a farm. I drove east to Ontario. I went to a small organic dairy operation that a woman ran. I wrote an article about that, and then I drove east, and it took forever to get through Ontario. I did visit an old friend, a guy who'd opened a restaurant in Panajachel, Guatemala, Steve, and he had sold the restaurant and moved back to Gore Bay, an island in one of the Great Lakes there. I visited him, and then drove to Manitoba. I had this plan to camp, and I could sleep in the back of my Saab. It was just long enough, and since I had everything in the clear plastic bags, I was actually moving from Pennsylvania. I could pile them on one side and then put the sleeping bag in, or I had a small sort of a mosquito net that I could put down. But the Canadian mosquitoes in June and July were absolutely the most voracious, most aggressive mosquitoes I had ever encountered. The African mosquitoes are much quieter and deadly. The malaria species of mosquitoes are more active after midnight. They're quiet and deadly. The Canadian mosquitoes were large, aggressive, and incredibly numerous. And I did one night, and even if I closed everything and put mosquito netting up, whether I slept in my car or outside, they just attacked. They got inside, and I gave up. And so I ended up staying in these little motels, $30, $40 a night, because I just didn't like submitting travel expenses to expensive places. And so I would find motels, and Canada had plenty of them out in the boonies. And I camped outside of Winnipeg, and then visited a hemp farmer, a hemp seed farmer. Cannabis hemp, of course, has almost zero tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, but it was still not legal to grow in the U.S. There was the zero tolerance policy implemented by, I think, the Reagan administration. And so the Canadians were growing it for hemp seed. Hemp for clothing was more labor intensive, so that was grown in places like India and elsewhere. So I wrote an article on that. Manitoba had been settled by Ukrainians, and so this farmer was a Ukrainian immigrant to Canada growing hemp seed organically. And so as I drove north from Winnipeg to go visit him, I could see these Russian Orthodox churches whose architecture was brought by the Ukrainians. And then eastward to Saskatchewan, I visited a very extensive, very large farm of rain-fed grain. And these 3 generations of farmers were growing flaxseed. They were organic growers, so they couldn't grow the GMO canola. It was mostly flaxseed and other crops that they would rotate with the flaxseed. And then drove through Alberta. I had to get to British Columbia, so I didn't do an article in Alberta, the Texas of Canada. And then I did an article in British Columbia, and then I went to Vancouver and connected with Elsa there to write the articles and go to the next stage. As long as I'm on the Canadians, I want to talk a little bit about how Canada and the Canadians have borrowed so much from the U.S. The Canadians do have a distinct culture from American, with many similarities, but also some clear differences. I want to show here one of my points about Canada. It's about the anti-smoking campaigns. And again, I want to invoke my California culture, because California, along with a few other states, really led the way in the multi-decade campaign against smoking, which the Canadians have taken up and borrowed and done now even better than what we have done in the U.S. to discourage smoking. And I might add that Canadians were heavy smokers. It's far in the north. They just had a tradition of smoking. And I remember going there. I went there in the early 70s, and then again in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And they were smoking in all of these, what they call pubs, bars, and public places. And there was heavy secondhand smoke. And that all changed in the last couple of decades. And so look what the Canadians have done. After decades, we were able to put a small warning label on cigarette packages. But look what the Canadians have done. Any cigarettes bought in Canada not only are heavily taxed, but are wrapped in this warning, and it shows someone dying from cancer and quotes them. And my ex-wife Elsa, who buys a package of cigarettes per month, says it makes a difference. People come in and they ask for the one that doesn't have the dying person. It's like a playground or something. Can't remember what it was. I want to digress a little bit and show how the tobacco industry managed to extend for so long the opposition and prevention of the anti-smoking regulations, because the petroleum industry had been using the strategies developed by the tobacco industry in order to deny global warming and the science of climate change, and funding science that is biased. And here's research that shows the industry-funded research versus the public funding of research, which shows a huge difference. 0% of the corporate-funded research comes out as showing a negative result of whatever it is, a chemical or of tobacco, and publicly funded research, which has been reduced because of the movement, particularly the Bayh-Dole Act of 1983 and other, where the funding of research was shifted over to private funding. And we, the consumer, we, the citizens, lose from this. But the private industry, in the case of, for instance, the campaign by the petroleum industry to sow doubt about the science of global warming and climate change, they took those strategies from the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry developed the big strategy was the sowing of doubt. And that has been their main thing. There have been some good movies on this subject. But the petroleum industry and then the chemical industry, in some of these chemicals that have been shown to be associated with cancer or cause cancer or endocrine disruption, they've all taken the strategies that the tobacco industry developed into sowing doubt and funding research and publicizing it. So anyway, that is an example of how the Canadians have let us do all the fighting and the funding of the nonprofits and the science on the effects of tobacco. And then they've gone and taken it farther in wrapping the packages of tobacco. I was contracted by Rodale New Farm to drive down the farmlands of the West Coast and interview and do articles for New Farm magazine on organic farmers. And so I drove down and contacted these farmers. One was a guy who looked like he would have been a pretty straight up spray and throw synthetic fertilizers type of farmer, but he said, hey, when I come home, I hug my kids, I now don't have to worry about contaminating my kids with some kind of pesticide. Went to a cherry grower farm, a potato grower, herbs in Oregon, went to the Palouse region of Washington State, which is an area that's similar to that area in the north of China that has what they call loess soils. These are soils that were deposited by wind, and so it's all former dust. And these places erode more easily than any other farmlands in the world because they have these small hills. And so they were some of the first to go with zero tillage, which is very important there. Then down Oregon to small grain grower as well as a mega farm, the kind that you see from the airplanes that have the circular irrigation. These are mostly in the eastern parts of Washington and Oregon, and then into Idaho and Nevada, where there's very extensive farms. And visited the farm of an old friend, Alan Dong, who I had worked for at the University of California, Davis. He's outside of Eugene. Then down into California to visit a wine grape growers, some of the first growers and makers of organic wine, a Fry family, covering as well one of the first 4 farmers markets in California was my hometown of Davis. And then down to Salinas, to where very large operations of organic salad crops are grown, as well as organic strawberries, and down the coast to all the way down to the San Diego area. New Farm then contracted me to drive down through Mexico and do stories on organic and sustainable farming and indigenous farming in Mexico. And by this time, on my way through Davis, I had picked up the Dolphin camper. This was just a lucky find. Some friends, Jim and Sue Som, had this Dolphin camper for many decades. It was a 1979 Toyota with a little 4-cylinder engine, the kind that they have all over the world. I've ridden in many, many times, holding the world together, carrying huge loads. There's a real following for the Dolphin. Starting with Ensenada and then in various towns and the outskirts of cities on the way down through Mexico and into Guatemala, I had the local craftsmen and mechanics do various work on Dolphin for, a fifth or less than what it would have cost in the U.S. And so I had things put on. I had a bicycle rack put onto the back in Ensenada. I took out this stove with an oven that was in there, as well as a hot water tank. Those things were heavy. And I just put in a tabletop gas stove. I could heat water. I had them build cupboards so I could store a lot of stuff in the Dolphin. I took out the passenger seat, and I could pile stuff there for when I wanted to use the cabin part of the Dolphin. It was great. I could sit at my little dining table, and I could actually reach all the way to the tabletop stove. And this was what they call a Type C RV, which is the very smallest. It had a tiny little toilet. It actually had a little shower, and you could just close the toilet and you could shower. There was a drain at the bottom of the little bathroom. It was such a great find. These friends, the Psalms, when I said, well, I only have about $1,000 I can pay. We did this sort of reverse bargaining. She said, I think $800 would be better. It had a little propane refrigerator that was so good that I had to keep it cracked open a tiny bit in order to keep it from freezing everything. And there was nothing I could do to get it to not get that cold. And it took very little propane. And of course, propane is easy to buy, and I could fill my little propane tanks for a song down there. I have kept this in because a refrigerator is so important to me, and I'm such a foodie. And this next thing about being able to sleep under the stars. These are central to my life. I took the skylight out that was above the bed and just put a simple little wooden rainproof cover. And so at night I could take that off and look at the stars from the bed, which was over the cab. So I took everything out that was sort of excess. And my YouTube video tour of Inside My Dolphin has gotten the most hits of any of my videos, something like nearly 20,000 now. The Dolphin camper was a great thing to have because driving down into Mexico, the roads are smaller. I could drive through small towns and villages. It was 17 feet long, so it was about the size of a large pickup truck. So I could park in the parking lots of these supermarkets and then go in and buy stuff, and I could do my cooking and eat and even stay and sleep. Although usually in Mexico, I would go find a farmer or a camping place because it's not safe to just pull over and camp overnight in any old place like it is in California. Although California, it's usually the police would come and I had a Wi-Fi scanner, and back in 2004 there were still a lot of Wi-Fi signals that were open. We didn't have the problem of people hacking into these things quite yet. At least it hadn't become a big problem. And so I could drive around and scan for a Wi-Fi signal and then park there and check email and write my articles and do the correspondence and all those kinds of things. Either do that or I would go to little internet cafes that were all over Mexico. That's how most Mexicans got onto the internet, was by going to these internet cafes and just paying a small amount to get onto the computers. The drive down through Baja California was beautiful. What was really memorable for me were not only the drives, the deserts that had so many different types of cactus. Also in Baja California, they really took good care of their shrines. These shrines are all over Mexico, and I think the drivers who apply these highways every week to go from Baja Norte to Baja Sur and down to Los Cabos maintain these shrines. Enjoyed stopping at those. Some of these shrines were outside of villages that became cities, and the shrines can't be moved. And Baja has a long history. It goes back to the 1600s when the Jesuit fathers built missions, or was it Franciscans? And so they've done some innovative things. Here's one of a car dealership that simply made one of the car spaces, left the shrine there. These were dirt roads that went from village to village, and now some of them are urban places. Here's another one that was simply raised up so that people could build their house there and keep the shrine in its place. Northern Baja, up just inland from Ensenada, has a wine country, and they make really good wines. The immigrants really started that, and now there's a thriving wine industry there that the Mexicans are very proud of. I think most of those wines get sold to the urban areas like Mexico City and Guadalajara, because Mexicans really like to have their own wines. And there were some really good ones. So I visited a wine grower who was growing their grapes organically. In Los Cabos, I visited a guy named John who managed a cooperative of Mexican farmers that grew herbs and tomatoes and various vegetables for sale up in California. Not sure if they're still going, but I did correspond with him for quite some time. And that was in Los Cabos. Then I drove up to La Paz, which is not far up the east coast of Baja, and drove on to the ferry that goes across to Mazatlan. And from Mazatlan, I drove up into central Mexico. I visited a farmer in the state of Nayarit who grew the blue agave, which they make tequila from, although only the agave grown in the state of Jalisco could be called tequila. I'm not sure whether the tequila companies buy some of their blue agave from other states like Colima and Nayarit and then make them into what they call tequila. I don't know how exactly that's done. My friend Craig Reynolds, who is now growing blue agave in California, any distilled product from agave that comes from outside the state of Jalisco in Mexico is called mezcal. And many different states of Mexico have their own mezcals. And mezcal also is made differently than tequila. Tequila can get the pure taste of the blue agave probably better than traditional mezcal, because what they call the piña, the big, huge thing that looks like a pineapple, but is 5 times, 10 times bigger, they actually steam that in autoclave and then crush it for the juice. The mezcal is made by roasting it in pits, and so it takes on the flavor of the wood fire and smoke, and it's quite tasty, but that is a real difference. So if I'm going to taste the 100% agave tequilas, I like to taste the ones that aren't aged in the barrels that are burned. They get these barrels from the rum industry, apparently, And some of the tequilas that are yellow in color and gold in color take on the flavor of the charred wood, but the real purist would want the straight up clear tequila that has the pure taste of the blue agave. And so then I went up to central Mexico where the main highway goes up and down north and south. One of the things I really learned to enjoy, the Tepoztlan was an ancient city. Mexico goes back, of course, to the 1500s. And on Sundays, they have the outdoor patios around the old Zocalo squares of these old cities, and they would have Sunday breakfasts. And those were fun to go to because the Mexicans are very gregarious people. They're easy to get to know and talk to, especially if you speak some Spanish. And so I enjoyed that, and the food was really good. I interviewed farmers outside of Tepoztlan. I rode my bike to see them. And was also an area where I could enjoy the pulque, which is a drink made from a type of a giant agave known as the maguey. And so I found the ideas that were outside of town, and some of the farmers enjoyed. They brought it and gave some to me. I rode my bike. The roads were not good, and I was probably not careful enough, but I got run off the road by a bus on a curve and knocked into a drainage ditch. Later came down with typhoid. And the doctors there know how to deal with typhoid, and they gave me these injections. And I had to, every week, go find someone, a nurse, who could inject me with this antibiotic for the typhoid. So after a couple of weeks in Tepoztlan, and having finished writing the articles that I had done up to that time, I drove south with a plan to get to Cuernavaca, which was on the south side of Mexico City. This was an agronomist who I interviewed at Chapingo, the Agricultural University of Mexico. And I feel I need to put this in about Mexico City. He had an only child, a daughter, who was a musician. And they lived near Chapingo, some 30 miles outside of Mexico City. And when the daughter, as a musician, wanted to develop, and so she moved to Mexico City, and she disappeared. And I'm only saying this because I have heard from other Mexicans that this kind of thing happens in Mexico City. And this professor died of a broken heart several years later. They never found her. She simply disappeared, probably got into a taxi, and those little Volkswagen Bug taxis are impossible to get out of if you're in the back seat. Anyway, I just need to say this because I've heard of this. At least one of the Mexican workers who came from Mexico City who took care of my dad verified that these things happen. And I just want to mention it because how many capital cities in the world does this happen where women just disappear without any seemingly adequate follow-up and law enforcement? And so I just feel I need to put this in. Mexico City was the worst experience in Latin America that I had ever had as a result of the police. The police around Mexico City are so corrupt. Each municipality around Mexico City, DF, the federal district, but there are these municipalities around, and the highways go through each one. So I had to pass through these municipalities, and these police would come up alongside and tell me to pull off. And it was very scary. I knew they wanted a bribe, a mordida. And so the first one that came along, I just stopped on the highway before I got to the exit, because I knew if I got to the exit and I was isolated. But right on the highway, the guy was on a motorcycle and he came up to the driver's side of the Dolphin. I closed the windows, locked the doors, and then I put my documents up against the window, driver's license, visa, documents showing that I was legally in the country, the registration and all that. And he said in Spanish, go to that exit. And I shook my head no, and he started getting really angry, and he actually kicked the door and then rode off because he was wasting his time. It was a highway. The cars were rushing by, and so he couldn't really break into my car, and he couldn't call backup. If I had been a criminal or if I had been something illegal, he could have called backup, but then a commander, a higher up, would have come and gotten all the money. And so he just rode off. And then in the next municipality, similar thing happened, but this time I didn't stop. I just kept driving, and at this point I was going around the east side trying to get to Cuernavaca, where I had been in 1976. So it had been 25 years since I'd been to Cuernavaca, but I gave up on getting to Cuernavaca. The first highway that went east towards the city of Puebla I took, and went east, and I went across the big causeway that Mexico City has just east of it, the famous one that Hernando Cortez crossed to conquer Montezuma. Fascinating story about Cortez and his men. It's more than just Neil Young's Cortez the Killer. Cortez had other tribes who were allied against the Aztecs, or what they now call the three allies. They're known as three different tribes, I guess, that had come together to form the Aztecs. But if you read that story about Cortez, it's quite incredible what they went through, and how they were all but defeated on the causeway coming across and had to retreat. The majority of them were wounded. The way they treated wounds back then, they would heat up beef fat and pour it on to the wound. And of course that would sterilize it. And then the fat does a lot to, I guess, heal wounds. But anyway, that was a very interesting read. And so I camped east of Mexico City in the Teotihuacan that was near the pyramid, the famous pyramids. And I went and visited those and camped there for, I think, a week, and had to contact my friends in Cuernavaca and described my experience with the Mexico City police, and they apologized. And then from there, from Puebla, I drove south to the city of Oaxaca. And of course, Puebla for me had some meaning because it was where they have discovered the earliest forms of corn, which was domesticated, of course, in Mexico. And they believe it was around Puebla that these tiny little corn cobs were found in caves that were the size of those little tiny ones that they put in cans. So I drove south to Oaxaca and stayed there for a week, I believe. And I wrote stories about the maize, the corn being grown outside of Oaxaca. This was where the original lines of corn existed. I use corn and maize interchange. Americans, we use the term corn. So the issue was that Mexican larger farmers were getting the seed of transgenic, genetically modified corn. It had not been approved for Mexico, but they wanted to use it because they had glyphosate, herbicide, in Mexico. And so they wanted to be modern and grow this corn. But the problem was, and I wrote an article on this, that the corn is wind pollinated, and the pollen from transgenic corn had been shown to get into the native corn. And there was a research article about that by a guy named Ignacio Chapela at University of California, Berkeley, and he was denied tenure because going against against genetic engineering was a very risky thing to do at any of the agricultural universities in the United States. And the company had very powerful allies and could attack anybody who wrote even scientific articles that were contrary to genetic engineering. And so I did write about this later. This was also where the Zapotec people had an ancient tradition of weaving rugs, which I still have. After that, I drove to the state of Chiapas, to the city of San Cristobal de las Casas, and I found a farm outside of that city to camp for a week or two, and again write my articles. It was there that I listened to a very weak radio signal from the U.S. about the election of 2004 and learned that George W. Bush had won. I'm still crying in my beer about the 2000 election, which essentially Ralph Nader, being a third-party candidate, took Al Gore from us. And then we had the invasion of Iraq, which I opposed, and while I was in Pennsylvania, had gone to New York City to march with 1 million people to protest that upcoming invasion. And here I am, and I keep that photo because what we have now is a completely destabilized Middle East, with Iran having become very powerful, and Syria and Russia. We got through the ISIS movement, which never would have happened if we had just left our hands off of Iraq. We learned powder keg that Saddam Hussein was sitting on. And so we now have a destabilized Middle East, deeply mired in Iraq. We eventually lost, I guess, 3,000 soldiers and diluted and pulled our forces away from Afghanistan, and therefore eventually lost Afghanistan. And that still hurts. It still hurts. It was in Oaxaca that I got to know one of the players in the Mexican organic agriculture scene. And he took me to a couple of farms in his little Volkswagen Bug. Of course, the Volkswagen Bug, Mexico was the last surviving country that was producing them. And they're still around. They're quite proud of these little bugs that were manufactured for a long time in the city of Puebla. It was in Oaxaca that I did the tour of forest-grown coffee farms. And I had to find a nurse because I had to be injected with this antibiotic for the typhoid. And we ran around and had a lot of trouble finding a qualified person to give an injection, which was in the behind. And so that's what I remember from that part of Mexico, of Oaxaca. My friend bought a glass carboy, 5 gallons of the mezcal, and brought it back. It's also where I went to visit coffee farms. He was in touch with the coffee growers, and some of the finest coffees in the world are grown in southern Mexico, in Chiapas and in Oaxaca. From Chiapas, I drove south to the border of Mexico and Guatemala and crossed into Guatemala at Tapachula, and then via the city of Quetzaltenango, otherwise known as Xela, Xela, the old Mayan name, I drove to the town of Panajachel on the lake, the Lago Atitlan, and it's picturesque. Back in the 70s, when I was in Comalapa, I would go to Panajachel to just be able to speak English with some gringos and get some gringo food once a month, I guess. It is a town where expats have set up some businesses. Here's Mike and his cafe. He finds the best coffees, and some of the best coffees in the world are grown in that region, whether it's southern Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, El Salvador. All of them grow some of the best coffees in the world. I went to visit a Catholic father across the lake in a town called Santiago Atitlan, underneath the volcano that's on the other side of the lake from Panajachel. And he had a coffee growing and production place. And later I went to visit a medium to large coffee finca and interviewed a guy about his coffee production. He was selling to Starbucks. The quality of coffee is vetted carefully by the professional tasters because there are at least a dozen steps that coffee has to go through, from where it's grown and how it's grown to harvest to processing, peeling, and there's several steps in there where they ferment or they just allow it to sit and take off the gelatinous peel, and then they dry it and store it. So all of those steps, if one of them is just done a little bit wrong, like maybe there's a little bit too much moisture in the storage or the drying, it rains a little bit, then the professional tasters will pick that out. They'll downgrade it. They can taste it. And so coffees that are from the small cooperatives, like, I can't remember the father's name, but he had been there even in the 70s when I was there. That's why I went to visit him. He was working with all of the villages around that area. But if one of those steps just goes wrong, it's not done perfectly, then that coffee gets downgraded by the tasters, and that particular cooperative or company gets downgraded. And so that's why many of these quality coffees come from fairly large fincas where someone is really in charge and on top of things and able to manage well that whole process. That area across the lake, Santiago Atitlan, was an area that was very active during the Civil War, and there were guerrilla units working in that area, living up on the mountain and in villages, and the Guatemalan army came through places and in some cases killed indiscriminately. My dad and mom had been working for some years to support the widows of the men who were killed, and many of them were simply out working their farms. There was a lady, Chonita, who had a cooperative business of making jewelry, and she hired these young women to make jewelry, which my mom and dad brought to Davis and sold at the farmers market. And all of that money they would then send back down to Chonita, which then would go to buying these weekly packages of food for these widows. And my parents also worked with an organization known as Famdegua, Familias of the Disappeared. There were many people who the army and the death squads took away and disappeared them, obviously murdered them. And so there was an organization, Famdegua, that investigated that. And my parents supported that financially, along with a number of other people in Davis who were part of what they called the Davis Religious Community for Sanctuary, was the umbrella organization that mom and dad had co-started that funded this organization. Famdegua also hired the Argentinian forensic archaeologists because it was in Argentina where they developed that science. And back in the early 70s, so many people had been disappeared. And there was a movie about that. So these Argentinian forensic archaeologists came in, and they were in charge of digging out the remains and showing that when the army came through, they actually had murdered women, children, old men, and the guerrillas had disappeared by that time. I went to visit the family I had stayed with back in the 1970s in Comalapa, and this was 25 years later. And so we had a reunion and did a lot of talking and catching up on things. It told me about how things had changed, that it was in the early 80s, during that time that I was gone, that the Civil War, the violence, la violencia they called it, had occurred for several years. The army came through Comalapa, the countryside. One of the families that I worked with was massacred out in their fields when they were working, cutting wood and working their fields. And I remember them. They were just a perfectly peaceful family. Here's a mural that was drawn. You can see that the fire is made from the old rifles that symbolically they're showing being burned, essentially saying the violence is over, we need to move on. The main street through Comalapa had been paved. Another of the big changes was the influx of the evangelicals otherwise known as evangelicos, into Guatemala. Guatemala and Brazil were the two countries that the evangelicals really made inroads, and they had set up a tent directly across from my family's house. And when they had their daily services, the bullhorns that were set up outside the tent would broadcast the sermon to my devout Catholic family and the other families around. That was one of the big changes. My family, the Catus, remembered that my favorite foods were this. It was actually a vegetable nightshade that I talked about it in a previous chapter, but they went out in the fields and picked it for me and made it. It's a very nutritious leafy vegetable that they boil up like spinach. And then amaranth grain was another of my favorites because it was originally developed in Central America and southern Mexico and central Mexico, and was actually discouraged or even prohibited, even banned by the Spanish church, because they made a type of sweet food from it that was part of the Mayan religious celebrations. This is the view of the town of Comalapa from my family's house. You can see Catholic churches there. On the left is the old one that was nearly destroyed by the earthquake that occurred in 1976, which was the reason why we went down to work with these people. And then on the right is at least one of the newer ones, because the old one is too badly damaged for people to actually use. Comalapa has always been isolated. It's very mountainous to get into Comalapa, but they have finally paved the road now. I think sometime in the 2000s, paved the road that goes in those mountains, but they were sort of blissfully isolated for many, many years because of the mountainous nature of getting in there. I went to Costa Rica and did circles on quality coffee, and also went to Turrialba, where they were doing research on organic pest management of banana and challenging things like that. I flew in a DC-3 airplane down to the town of Golfito, where United Fruit Company had had their headquarters until 1985 and had grown and shipped bananas from there. And there happened to be a guy on that trip who I got to know, who was an expert. He was a botanist, and his expertise was in palm trees. And so we walked through the neighborhood where the United Fruit Company executives had lived, and it was like a botanical garden. They had brought scores of species of plants from all over the tropics to grow there, and they especially loved palm trees, and so there were dozens and dozens of different species of palm trees, and this guy could identify them, and so that was really interesting to me as a plant scientist. There's a national park there that is interesting to tour with the original tropical forest. Golfito's down near the border of Panama. I also enjoyed experiencing all the different fruits, or so many different fruits of Costa Rica, in the markets, in the forests, in the botanical gardens. And we're beginning to see more of these in the produce sections of our supermarkets. At the research institute that I went to, they were also interested in researching what are known as effective microorganisms, which is a collection of bacteria, fungi that are used to compost things and are used to make a spray of these organisms that reduce the smells in corrals, places where cattle and horse manure are. All of these countries are friendly, and Costa Rica is possibly the friendliest to Americans, but I still encountered some of the deeply embedded anti-American sentiment. I went to a soccer game with a couple of Costa Rican friends. The Costa Rican national team was playing the U.S. national team. And I was up in the cement block stands, cheap seats, and I can't remember the outcome of the game, but when I stood up for one of the plays, when I was ready to sit down, I found half of an orange that had already been squeezed sitting there where I had been sitting, and I just swept it onto the ground and ignored it. But I think these things kind of allow the deeply embedded anti-American sentiment in Latin America to rise up. Visited the Caribbean, and it's quite different there. The climate is different, the water's different, it's more humid. I also went to Haiti with the Rodale International Programs Director to explore possible Haiti look like the troubled country that we all read about. And I can't really reflect any more on that except to, if you're interested in Haiti, read the New York Times series that was done, how the French bankrupted Haiti after their revolution, in which they threw out the enslavers. I do have a couple of memories of Haiti. We went to the opposite side of the island from the capital. We went to Port-de-Paix and Cap-Haïtien, and we drove from, I think, to another city to look at these programs in collaboration with, I can't remember which organizations. And I just remember it should have been a major road from one city to another city. And I think it was 60 miles, but it took like 9 or 10 hours of dirt, rocky, eroded road with this road building machinery rusted and faded. But you could see the donated by USAID or United States faded all down that road. And I think that is probably a common story there. Also, these two countries, Haiti and Dominican Republic, share the island of Hispaniola. And you can see the border quite easily between the two because on the Haiti side, there's deforestation, and on the Dominican side, you can see farms or forests intact. I then flew to Cuba, where I did at least one article on how the Cubans were taking advantage of all of the food waste that they had and composting it, which back in 2004 was newsworthy. I also visited where they make cigars. Having always been an aficionado of tobacco, I enjoy a quarter of an inch of a good cigar, and played dominoes with them, or tried to. When I arrived at the airport in Havana, I took a bus into Havana and then just started walking around, and I knew it was safe. I just walked up to a group of young men who were playing dominoes on the sidewalk. Speaking Spanish, I just said, I'm looking for a place, for a room to rent. And one of them said, come with me, and took me over to one friend, and that friend took me into an apartment building that was probably 3 or 4 stories, up this dark stairs, which anywhere else in the world, you'd never go into a dark stairwell alone. But in Cuba, you could do that. There was so little crime there of this type. There's a good documentary on Cuba called the Cuba Libre Story. It's on Netflix. It's a 6-part Cuba and the history, and it shows both sides. It was quite well balanced, and did talk about how Cuba became a drug smuggling center for cocaine coming to the U.S. But so that kind of crime, of course, was around. But the guy had been ostracized by the neighborhood committees for some reason or another. He was an outsider, and this was something in Cuba that's pretty serious. You couldn't get the type of services that you needed. There were very tightly controlled neighborhood committees that were part of the Castro government, the communist government. And this guy had fallen outside of that, and he told me about that. I was there a couple of days, and so not an easy place to live, Cuba. It was fun riding in some of the ancient American cars that had stayed there from the 1950s. These cars, you can ride in them on the main boulevards. They're called máquinas, and they ply up and down the main boulevards, many miles across Havana. And then if you want to go on the side streets somewhere, then you hail one of the little Russian or Yugoslav or Lada cars, and then those will take you to different places. The restaurants were typically communist, the waiters surly and acting as if you did not deserve to be served by them. I went to a market and bought some things that was kind of like a flea market, bought some photos that had probably been reproduced hundreds of times, but photos of Fidel Castro. Didn't have time to go out to the countryside. I just stayed in Havana. I just needed to do one or two articles. I used to salsa dance. I had learned back before they even had named it salsa in Colombia in the 1970s, and it really developed in the United States in the 1990s. There were salsa clubs that opened up, and I used to go with a bunch of friends who were, they were mostly Latin American, from all the different countries in Latin America, plus some Americans, both Latino and Anglo. But I found these places in Havana that you could go to in the afternoons, and they played salsa music, dance, and I loved doing that. It was one of the best things I found about Havana, because Cuba is one of the centers of salsa. Many of the great salsa bands are Cuban exiles. I didn't fool myself into thinking that this was any kind of workers' paradise or anything. I knew that there were things that they were treating me well. They had started their tourist industry just a few years before and were treating tourists quite well. But I could see it was difficult to survive there. They didn't have great food. They were eating a lot of starchy food. Things like butter and meat were in very short supply. So that ended my sojourn as a journalist in Central America and the Caribbean. I wasn't going to do very much about my 2 years at Imperial Valley College, but I really feel the need now that I've started to set the record straight. This is also by way of an explanation to people like my brothers and a few maybe of my former colleagues and students at Imperial Valley College, but especially my brothers who've been a bit bewildered about my 2 years there and why I went off to Africa. So I've put up photos that are relatively entertaining for you. Imperial Valley was an interesting place. I have put up documents, especially for people who need to look at what happened, and I just put them up very briefly so that it goes fast. Those 2 years were very important to me, and my experience there was not only memorable, but I think noteworthy. The Imperial Valley was part of California that was almost like a space warp. You drive for 2 hours through the desert if you're coming from the north, or over mountains if you're coming from San Diego, to get to this world that is really quite different from the rest of California. It was about 90% Mexican Americans, and I spoke Spanish. I knew the Mexican culture, and I was hired along with 13 other faculty, which is unprecedented. In 2005, they were expanding the community colleges, and Imperial Valley College needed to expand. And I was the only one really liked it there. Most of the new people who came from all over the United States, the new faculty, really were only putting up with it. And this one faculty member who had been in the same program in Davis with me almost couldn't stand it. She went to San Diego every weekend for at least the first year, and later applied for and got a job at California State University. But I actually liked it, but unfortunately was the only one, maybe with one other, the only one of those 13 whose contract was not renewed. I was dismissed. My students were about 90 to 95% Mexican American kids, really nice kids. It was completely different from the Southern California, Los Angeles, Hispanic world. Nobody knew of any gangs there. The kids were just real nice. They were sweet. They were in the very bottom performers statewide coming out of the high schools. Only about half of them, and in some cases more than half, I had to fail in my class. But these kids were so sweet. I would tell them, look, I can't pass you. And I think they knew that. I took everything down to the minimum of what a community college could pass, in the environmental science class that I taught that was required, and that the advisors sent these students to my class when they first entered. It was sort of a weeding out type of class. And I would tell them, look, come back, go get your skills, your reading and your writing skills, your academic skills, bring them up and come back. You can take my class again. And I would see these kids. One of the big businesses in the Imperial Valley were the box stores and department stores like Costco and Walmart and Macy's. The people who lived in Mexicali, the Mexicans, would come across the border in droves, and they would buy all these things in the U.S. box stores and then drive back to Mexicali. And so it was a big business. And I would see these kids working. They were hired, and I would see them. And so I remember one going into Macy's to buy a pair of socks, and one kid came up to, Dr. Lauder, hi, how are you? And sorry, I can't remember your name. Oh, so-and-so. And I remember I'd failed him, but they didn't hold it against me. Really sweet kids. I really liked it there. And having grown up in the valley in California, I was tolerant of the heat. One of the things I really enjoyed was identifying the kids who didn't know it, but they really had university potential. Especially the young women, because, well, the guys too. I remember the one sort of rough-edged guy who was probably working in a garage somewhere, coming in, but this would occur with some of the women too, who, the young women, they were catering usually in their culture to mother and grandparents to start get married and start having kids. And the thing is that out of the 40 kids in my class, there were always 3 or 4 or 5 who, even though they didn't have the high schools were just, not very good. They didn't have the academic skills, but you could see that they just did well on the tests. They could just pick things up. They could follow my advice on using flashcards, whatever, and just did well. And I really enjoyed, towards the end of the semester, coming up to one of these kids and saying, have you thought about applying to university? And the young woman would say, I remember this one saying, I wouldn't be able to be away from my family, her mom and dad and brothers and sisters, because they're very family oriented there in the valley, Imperial Valley. And I'd say, well, if you can apply to, say, Cal Poly Pomona or one of the Occidental colleges or San Diego State, you can drive home every weekend. And it was just fun kind of opening up those doors, which just didn't occur. It doesn't occur in places like Davis. And so one of my students did go on to get a PhD at University of California, Riverside. I'm kind of laughing at myself because I think you can probably sense that I get excited about this kind of thing. Showing students, telling them, hey, you could go to university. I was in charge of the Imperial Valley College, otherwise known as IVC, Agriculture Club. And that was joined by a local young woman, Deborah De La Riva, as well as Ashley Menville and a couple of others. Robert Menville, who was Ashley's father, sort of oversaw my running of the agriculture club because his daughter was in it. Debbie and Ashley both took my environmental science course and then my entomology course, and they formed the major part of the agriculture club. The agriculture club won the award for Club of the Year I took those students, Ashley and Debbie, all local, and a couple of other local students to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and then UC Riverside. Debbie, a local El Centro young lady, went on to get her PhD in entomology, where I had taken her and the students on that field trip. I was terminated by a committee, none of whom had or have PhDs. Rogers, who at that time was interim president, and none of whom have a background of academic integrity, such as I grew up in. An academic vice chancellor had left, who had a PhD there. There were no other issues other than a political difference in my dismissal. I want to emphasize this about my dismissal, that it was purely political and there were no other issues, behavioral or anything unspoken here. I think that's really important. They said I was, quote, not a good fit. It was political. It was because I really focused on the Mexican kids down there, Mexican American, of course, 95% of the students at Imperial Valley College. And at that time, the Imperial Valley was run by the white, very wealthy farmers, vegetable growers, and they wanted me to put together and draw the white kids, okay, the Anglo kids. And I did not say no to that. I just needed to form the program around the majority of my students and then go to the next step. But I was told by one of the deans, whose name I forget, that I could put together my own advisory committee. And he told me that when I started because he knew the guy who ran the agriculture program advisory committee was a very wealthy vegetable grower by the name of, and he was a blatant racist. He invited me early on over to his house. I was in my first month, I think, and he used the N-word to refer to black people right there at the table, very clear. And I knew right then that what Dean Gonzalo Huerta had told me, that I could form new advisory committee. I knew why he had told me that. However, I did not tell anybody. He had said this, used the N-word. I didn't document it, and when I brought it up at my hearing, when I contested my dismissal, the person who was overseeing the hearing dismissed it because I had not documented it or told anybody. And it was because I knew that I was just going to form a new committee. I learned later that the vast majority of these hearings, they hold up the decision of the college. I should have hired a lawyer, but I thought it was an open and shut case. At that time, when they decided to dismiss me, it was because for just something like 6 months, there was no president. President Paul Pye had left. The academic vice chancellor, Kendra Jeffcoat, had left the school. There were a lot of problems there. And the interim president of the community college was a teacher who was a friend of the head of the advisory committee, because the white community in the Imperial Valley was quite small and they all knew each other. And so it was just a 6-month period, perhaps. I don't know when they got a qualified president for the school and academic vice chancellor. It's difficult for them to get people into the Imperial Valley. People didn't want to go live in that community, which I liked, but it was just during that time. So that's why I had this committee that dismissed me, that was made up of 3 people with no PhD and who were basically not qualified to decide on my case. It's water under the bridge. One of the things I wanted to do at IVC was to develop a program for Spanish-speaking pest management advisors. If you talk to any farmer or anybody involved in agriculture, they will tell you that the pest management monitoring and management is so important. And you have to have a license from the state of California, known as a pest control advisor license, which was not easy to earn, and actually was beginning to start in the spring of 2007, was what would have been a statewide group for Spanish-speaking pest control advisors. And anyone will tell you that this would have been important because nearly all of the workers in the fields are Mexican and Spanish-speaking, and this program could have done trainings of workers in the fields by Spanish-speaking PCAs, pest control advisors. I did put up on YouTube a small guide to passing the PCA test that they do in Sacramento and probably in other down in Southern California, which has received numbers of hits. Not an easy thing. It takes half a day. There's a lot of people who don't pass. You cannot do any pest control advising, even organic, without that PCA license. And so that YouTube video, I still get emails from people and comments. I created a Microsoft Word document that you could make flashcards from, because you had to memorize all these different, not only insects, but different types of pesticides and things. The PCA license video was made as one of my applications to the small agriculture programs in community colleges around California that I applied to in the 2 years after I had been dismissed from Imperial Valley College. In this case, College of the Redwoods. But unfortunately, the committees, which were made up mostly of English teachers, shop teachers, geography teachers, were focused on vocational education, which was what community colleges at that time were focused on. And actually, I found out later that they were very negative about anyone with a PhD. It was threatening to them because most of them did not have PhDs. They were focused on what they called career technical. And I was trying to get the message across that many of your students, as many as half, needed training and education as preparation to go on to universities. But at that time, it was not a priority. Within 5 years, it became a priority to have this two-pronged approach to community college education. But that initiative to start a program to train pest control advisors with an emphasis on Spanish language fluency would have formed the basis for a strong agriculture program at IVC, along with another program that I initiated, which was to form a relationship with the very close by university and colleges in Mexicali, right across the border, only 10 miles away. And no one had ever made any contact with the agriculture programs over there. And I had developed a grant proposal to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to do that. And while at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Fellowship in Washington, D.C., I went to visit the person who oversaw those. And I tried to tell her, look, this was in 2006 when I didn't know that I was going to be dismissed. And she told me, just keep trying. And I wanted to tell her, along with this guy I had done it with, who was from San Diego State University branch in Calexico, nearby to El Centro. And agriculture was such a low priority with the local Mexican-American kids. They came from parents, most of whom had worked in the fields, and the last thing that these kids ever wanted to do was to go back into these fields. So we had very low numbers coming to the agriculture club or the agriculture classes. And so I was targeting things that would overcome that and show that if you speak Spanish and you work in agriculture, then you have an office and you'd be going to the fields to talk to workers, but you wouldn't be stuck in the fields. And that's what I wanted to do with that program. So those three things: the statewide program to train Spanish-speaking pest control advisors, the relationship with the university just across the border in Mexico, just 10 miles away, with the same environment as we had, and then obtaining grant money from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So after I was dismissed from IVC, I applied to 20 different positions in community colleges and a few in state universities. This was during the recession, so there were precious few openings, but the search committees just didn't seem to be interested in these things that I was presenting. They were really focused on vocational agriculture. And I also need to say that it was very clear that they really had a priority of bringing up the number of women in the faculty of the community colleges. And I'm not against that. And so the rest is history. I went to Africa where I could be valued for my teaching, which is what I wanted. As long as I'm on my teaching, I want to briefly look at the innovation I came up with in 2020 while teaching biology at California State University, Sacramento. I'm convinced that what I came up with, using what was then the state-of-the-art educational digital tools, that this method will become a core part of teaching in the future. I know this sounds like hyperbole, but I'm convinced. When we were all transitioned from the classroom over to Zoom and the Canvas learning management system at the beginning of the pandemic, I put a huge amount of time and effort into that 10-day downtime in the middle of spring semester 2020. The transition was traumatic for both teachers and students, and all of us were in a fog. I like to sum it up by the idea that this was such a radical change from 2,000 years of a teacher walking into a classroom after making sure one's fly was not unzipped or one's blouse not dripped on, and talking to students and writing on the board or firing up a prepared PowerPoint. So with this then new feature of Canvas known as new quizzes, I was able to use its auto-grading feature to instantly grade text input answers to quiz questions and therefore give 2 mini quizzes per lecture. Now, teachers, before you ditch saying, oh, there's no way I have time to even come up with 1 quiz per lecture, the 2 quizzes per lecture method that I use takes no more time than ordinary preparation for lecture. And I show this in my YouTube video. I can prepare both quizzes in about 10 to 15 minutes before a lecture. I show preparing a quiz in a video that's less than 3 minutes. So this replicated my policy of giving only written exams, which is what I did at Imperial Valley College and then subsequent teaching up to the lecture classroom at Sac State. I've never given multiple choice exams, which I think are inferior education compared to written exams. I want to emphasize here that this use of text input auto-graded quizzes can be used in the classroom now that students all have some kind of cloud accessing equipment like a laptop or phone. And I have actually taken these quizzes using the Canvas app on my phone. There's an app for both the iPhone and for Android. And a number of my students took the quizzes using their phones. And if I was back in the classroom, I would be figuring out some way that small groups of students could take the quiz with 1 laptop, groups of 2 or 3. And I'd just be figuring out a way that you would get past the situation of 1 student doing all of the answering. There's ways to do that. Just think it out. But that gets more into the active learning and team building types of things that we need to do in education. So with this auto-grading feature of Canvas and its automatic adding of the scores to a gradebook, which, by the way, also takes a roll, and student participation, are they there at the beginning of the class and the end of the class, I could give these 2 mini quizzes per lecture, 1 at the beginning and 1 at the end of the class, just 2 to 3 minutes each, and it worked really well to improve learning. Some version of this 1 or 2 auto-graded question text input mini quizzes per lecture, I believe, will become part of future education. especially as artificial intelligence develops for auto-grading the text answers. My classes averaged 55 students per class per semester, but this method would work with classes of over 100 because of auto-grading. The students gave the method great feedback, which I show in my videos, because exams and memorization stressed them so badly. So they relaxed with these small quizzes that were just a few minutes away, and you learn more when you're relaxed and not stressed. So the whole thing was serendipitous, because I never would have spent the considerable time to explore and test the Canvas new quiz feature back then were it not for the mandatory transition to 100% distance learning. And this adaptation actually made for better education than what I had been using in the classroom. My class actually became better as a distance learning. That's the serendipity part. This method can be used in the lecture hall also. A number of my students took the quizzes using the Canvas app on their phone, so it can be used in hybrid classes as well as distance learning classes. The big trend in teaching in past years has been implementing what is known as active learning. I took workshops and showed this method, but I didn't have any luck getting teachers to try it really. They have not realized that this is a form of active learning, because by the students' own comments, it keeps them engaged. Small quizzes, just a few minutes away, engages students in a way that complements the small group discussions of current active learning strategies. I review all of this in the YouTube videos and a PDF linked at californiaboomer.com. Well, I got a little bit ahead of myself by going from 2007 to 2020 in the teaching redesign, but I wanted to put those two college teaching segments together. And so in the next video, I reflect on my 6 years in Tanzania from 2009 to 2015. This gave me a total of about 10 years living in Africa over a time span of 50 years.
Anaanza safari yake ya kwenda nyumbani. He. Wa, 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 wa.